You're doing some tremendous work. You're speaking to people literally on both sides of the aisle, because for those who don't know, your podcast, Strange Bedfellows, is actually with a communist,
That's
someone
right.
a self-described communist. So you have a libertarian and a communist. So it's
That's about
literally
as
left and right.
strange bedfellows could ever get, right? You got a
You live up to the
libertarian
name.
and a communist hosting this show, and we bring in
Exactly.
people like, who are of all types, all political stripes, and then we talk and we have a great conversation, and we find out that we actually agree more than we disagree. We agree on the big stuff. And that's the point of the show. And I say that Bobby Kennedy is that strange bedfellows candidate. He's that guy who can bring together independents, Republicans, Democrats, libertarians, Greens, people who've never even voted before are going to resonate with him. I see that happening. I know you do too.
Exactly. Because just in the groups I've been part of and the conversations I've been part of, I can see the campaign really is everyone coming together. So it's a beautiful thing to be a part of, and it helped me get introduced to you too. So it's doing a lot of good right now. So with that being said, let's go ahead and transition to the next topic that I want to jump into. Right now, there's a war happening in Ukraine, as I'm sure everyone's heard about. And whenever you hear about it spoken about on the mainstream media, they tell you that the war started when Russia invaded Ukraine. They don't give you any of the backdrop behind, what led up to that. And if you actually go to left-wing media outlets before 2021, or I'm sorry, before last year, when the invasion started, you'll actually see tons of mainstream media outlets talking about the Nazi problem over in Ukraine. And you'll even see media outlets who acknowledge the fact that it was America and the CIA who organized the coup in Ukraine in 2014 that overthrew the government, largely not only with Nazi forces, but the most organized part of that seemed to have a heavy link to some of the neo-Nazis over there. So before Russia invaded, all this was common knowledge. And then as soon as Russia invaded, all that went out the window.
Everybody suddenly got amnesia about the Nazis, didn't they?
Exactly.
What Nazis?
Everyone
Nazis?
got
I don't see any Nazis. You see any Nazis? Nah, I don't see any Nazis.
And there's a specific article I always go to from The Guardian, which is, considered one of the most left-wing media publications out there, from 2014. The title of the article says, "It's not Russia who brought Ukraine to the brink of war." And now all of a sudden, it's like everyone at The Guardian forgot about all the past work they did every time they write an article. And to me, it's dishonest journalism. Like,
it is.
You can report the facts, but you should also give people relevant perspective behind the facts so they can understand why the facts are the way they are. So, with that being said, I do want to actually go back in time a little bit, because as we were speaking that night, you did actually, tip me off to a few things, because I actually didn't know how far back the CIA had a relationship with some of those neo-Nazis over there. So can you speak a little bit about the history, behind that, and how far back does the connection go between our intelligence agencies over here and some of those neo-Nazis in Ukraine?
All the way back to the very end of World War II. Even before there was a CIA, we were doing this. We were doing it through military intelligence. Let me take you back to 1945. And in April of 1945, as you know, Franklin Roosevelt died on April the 12th, just as the war is coming to an end and they're making plans for the post-war world. This was after Yalta, after he'd had a good meeting with Stalin, and Roosevelt's vision, of course, was to have a peaceful world order after the war, governed by, this international body, the United Nations, and we were all going to live in peace and harmony, and the Soviets and the West would get along, right? We were allies during the war. The plan was for us to stay allies after the war, but he died, unfortunately. And Winston Churchill had other ideas. As you probably know, Churchill was a fanatic anti-communist. It was only a marriage of convenience for a short time during World War II when Churchill made the alliance with Russia, with Stalin, because it was for their own survival. But there was no love lost there. Churchill and Stalin never got along. The friendship was always between Roosevelt and Stalin. So after Roosevelt died, Churchill came up with this idea, and it's the craziest thing you've ever heard. I don't know if you've heard of this one. It was called Operation Unthinkable. And he directed his military staff, the British military, the top brass that reported directly to Churchill. He wanted to do, before the war was even over, he wanted to reinvade Russia using British, French, American troops and, ready for this, and repurposed Nazi prisoners of war.
Oh, wow.
And they were, I mean, wow. And they were planning to invade Russia. Russia, who had been under attack and under invasion from the Nazis since 1941 and had fought their way out of it, pushed the Nazis all the way back to Berlin, won the damn war in Europe. You know, they did the lion's share of the fighting. They inflicted 80% of German casualties. They themselves lost at least 27 million. I've heard estimates as high as 30 million people in the Soviet Union who died during World War II. So what an unconscionable, unthinkable thing to do to your ally, to literally turn around, stab your ally in the back, and then invade them again a second time. So I don't know if Churchill was drunk or if he was just crazy, but that's why they called it Operation Unthinkable. It was completely crazy. And here's the craziest part, Jay, is we didn't even know about it until after the Cold War ended. Towards the end of the 90s, the British National Archives released the documents. And only then did the British government admit out loud, hoping the Russians wouldn't be too mad, that, yeah, we were planning to invade you as soon as the war was over. And wow, not only that, they were planning, or Churchill was trying to talk the new president, President Truman, Roosevelt's VP. He was trying to talk him into using a nuclear weapon on Russia. Wow. And this was before we nuked Japan. This was months before we dropped 2 atomic weapons on Japan. He literally wanted to nuke our ally. Just let that sink in.
And, if you think about it, that's terrible. And if you think about it from the Russian perspective, it must be so hard to even negotiate and trust someone after you see a situation like that. And then now, if you fast forward to modern day and you hear Angela Merkel's comments about the Minsk agreement and how Europe or Germany never had any intention of actually making Ukraine uphold their end of the bargain, like, it just seems like from their perspective, why would you trust us? So, I think we all need to just take a deeper look at history and understand their perspective a little bit more and respect
that part of the story that I just told you. That's only the prelude. Would you like to hear more?
Yes.
I got more.
Yes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. So tell
there's
us more
so much more.
Yes.
We could do a whole hour easy just on that, but you asked about the CIA, so I'm kind of getting there. But to lay the groundwork, the Cold War really began with Operation Unthinkable. Even though it was secret, it was no secret to Joseph Stalin. Stalin found out about it. He had spies inside Great Britain, and he knew all about the betrayal that the Western Allies were already planning. And he also knew, because his intelligence networks were very good, the NKVD, they had information, and it's later confirmed through declassified documents, that we, the Allies, the British, MI6, and military intelligence, both here and in the UK, were recruiting Nazis, getting them out of prisoner of war camps, both Germans and Ukrainians. The Ukrainian nationalists who were collaborating, they were Nazi collaborators. They were in prisoner of war camps. And our military intelligence was finding those who could be useful to us and basically
Operation
sparing
Paperclip.
them. Operation Paperclip is one of many of those examples where they spared these guys from prosecution at Nuremberg, spared them from the firing squad, which is probably where they would have ended up, spared them from life in prison, and started forming rat lines where they were bringing these guys out of Europe and they were putting them into South America and Brazil, Canada, and yes, the United States. But the Ukrainians specifically were of interest more to the CIA. When the CIA was created in 1947, one of their first priorities, as we can see now, I should tell you, these documents are publicly available, but we didn't know about it for almost 60 years. Almost 60 years. It was in the late 1990s that Congress passed a law called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. It was passed in 1998. And as it turns out, there were a lot of war crimes with Nazis that we were involved in that we had to disclose. The CIA had held those secrets for 60 years. And I've done several threads about it on Twitter where I take you through these documents and kind of explain the story from 1947 to the end of the Cold War in 1991. That's where the document trail ends, as far as the declassified documents, of course. And we probably wouldn't have those had the Cold War not ended. And of course, the KGB, they also declassified a ton of documents in the 90s. And so it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. You know, you take what we can get from declassified British documents, declassified Soviet documents, and declassified US documents. And so you start to put together the picture of what was going on. And what they were doing was they were working with the Banderite movement, the UPA, the UPA, the insurgent armies that were active during World War II, even before World War II.
Now, those just to clarify, those were groups who had Nazi like line of thinking, correct? So even though they weren't even though they weren't necessarily calling themselves Nazis, they had the exact same line of thinking and they were working directly with the Nazis, right?
Oh, yes. And a lot of them were SS battalions. So they had the uniforms. They had, official Nazi, they were Nazi troops that worked with Nazi Germany. So, yeah. And they shared the philosophy. They believed in eugenics. They believed in, breeding laws so that there was no intermixing of races and things like that. They were Nazis to their core, is what I'm saying. And, the Ukrainians try to spin this history to make it more palatable to the West. And they say, oh, we never had any real loyalty to Hitler. We were just fighting for the independence of our country, of Ukraine, because we didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. We hated the communists. We didn't want to be with them. So here was Ukraine, geographically set between the Soviet Union on the east and Europe to the west. And Ukraine, you could literally split that country down the middle practically. And the western half of Ukraine, historically for 100 years, has always considered themselves European. They tend to speak more European languages. Their culture is more European, and they're the white people. And then you go further to the east and you get into Soviet country. These are the people like in the Donbass who consider themselves Russians and they speak Russian. And, you tend to have more Slavic races over there. And these two camps have been warring with one another for over a century. This predates World War II. This goes all the way back to the Russian Civil War after World War I. And they're just natural enemies. The fascists and the communists have been fighting each other forever. So this is really a continuation of that. And the whole reason that the CIA was so interested in working with the Ukrainian nationalists during the Cold War was that they were guerrilla bands of warriors who would do incursions into the Soviet Union. Basically, they were efforts at regime change. We were trying to
Exactly.
overthrow the government of the Soviet Union, and we were using the Ukrainian nationalists and the Banderites to be our army over there because we wouldn't send our own troops. So it's not so unlike what we see happening today. We're still using the Ukrainian nationalists who have been funded, trained, and armed by the United States and the West and NATO to effect a regime change in Russia. It's the same old playbook, really, with just a fresh 21st century update.
Exactly. And, it's not like that's a unique situation. And that's the only time the US government has ever worked with, extreme groups. If if you go back to the Middle East, a lot of
Right.
people don't know, but Osama bin Laden actually had a name. I believe it's Tim Osman when he was working for the CIA,
Correct.
because he was anti-communist in
Right.
Afghanistan. So and we were actually arming them over there to go fight, the communists over there. So
Exactly.
we helped build up the Mujahideen. I'm pronouncing that wrong, but
You got
we
it
helped
right.
build. Oh, I did get it right. Okay, perfect. So we helped build up the Mujahideen. We helped empower the Taliban, and we helped empower like ISIS, like all of those guys, unfortunately. And
unfortunately, those are our guys.
Exactly. So, and if you actually even take it further back and you go to Grandpa Bush, Prescott Bush, a lot of people don't know, but the bank he ran actually got in trouble for funding some of the Nazi operations. So you have some people who, might believe that maybe there's some people over here in America who actually sympathize more with that cause than a lot of people know. And it's unfortunate because, not enough attention gets paid to that history. So there was a natural alliance there that is still happening today. The Nazis in Ukraine don't like Russia. America doesn't like Russia. Well, let me not say America. Some people in the American government don't like Russia. And because of that, they're willing to work with literally anyone, like around the globe. It seems, unfortunately, who's willing to present a challenge to them or to attack them in some way, shape, or form. So we really have to ask ourselves, even if we disagree with communist ideology and we think it's a bad thing, how can we really call ourselves like a democracy if we don't let people self-determine their own fate? Like if they want to try communism and crash and burn, let them do that. Like there's no reason for us to try and force that onto like other countries too. So
well, that's the way President Kennedy felt about it. Coming up this weekend, actually, Saturday, June the 10th, is the 60th anniversary of a very important speech that I think is the best speech President Kennedy ever gave. 1963, it's the American University speech, but most people just call it
Guerrillas by Night.
Yeah, they call it, I guess we just call it the peace speech. And it was the first time that any American president since World War II, since Roosevelt, had talked about the sacrifice that the Soviets made in World War II, the tremendous price that they paid, our friendship, our one-time alliance, and that we should respect the Russian people for their many achievements in science, in the arts, in warfare and diplomacy. He was trying to extend a hand at the height of the Cold War. Remember, this is just about 9 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? When we were toe to toe and almost went to nuclear war. He and Nikita Khrushchev decided that this was madness. We had to do something about nuclear testing. And one of their first collaborations that summer was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That speech that he gave, trying to warm up the Cold War, trying to extend a hand of friendship to Russia in that speech. I mean, there are some who say or believe that that's the speech that got him killed.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I remember the first time I heard that, that was what made me look into all of JFK's other policies, because he said some of the things that I was thinking, but didn't really know like how to put into words into such like a succinct way. And he touched on so many points there that I really think it's important, you know, for people to take a look at. And a lot of what he said, I think is still 100% relevant today. And I think it's a speech that everyone should be familiar with. If it was up to me, I think we should teach it in schools.
I do
I think,
too.
yeah,
I do
yeah,
too. I
we
think
should
it's
teach it
more
in schools.
relevant than ever right now at this very moment. I'm going to be
Mhm.
joining, Jose Vega. He's the guy
Yes,
that goes
he
around
was.
disrupting all of the politicians' town hall meetings.
Yes,
I'm
yes,
going on his
yes.
show Thursday to, I guess he's doing a special show just about that speech at American University. So I'm going to go in
I'm
and just do a
excited.
whole show about
I'm gonna
that.
take a look at that.
Yeah,
And
I
one
thought
of
you'd like
the
that.
other parts I would hope people at least consider, and I don't want to dive too much into that part today, but he also mentioned secret societies in that
Mhm.
speech. And I think you know, not to dive too deep into quote unquote conspiracy territory, but I think it's important that, you know, we acknowledge that there's some organizations that exist that keep their plans to themselves.
Yeah.
And it might be in our interest to at least ask some questions about, you know, what could be going on, you know, like in some of those meetings. But,
You know what's
you know,
interesting? That speech you just mentioned, that was actually a different speech. It was in
oh, that's the different one.
1961. And it was
Ah,
right after the
okay.
Bay of Pigs. It was called, I think it's called The President in the Press, but it was a speech he gave shortly after the Bay of Pigs. And he was saying that Americans have always been historically opposed to secret societies,
Yes,
secret
yes.
oaths, secret
Ah,
proceedings. And in my mind, what that speech was really about, without him saying it plainly,
mm-hmm,
was the CIA, because it was the
mm,
CIA that caused the whole debacle at the Bay of Pigs. And Kennedy was furious about that. He later basically fired Alan Dulles and Richard
mm,
Bissell and Charles Cabell, the three top dogs there at
mm,
the agency. And I think that he was talking about, in code perhaps, for future historians to figure out. I think he was talking about the CIA and their secret programs that Americans didn't know about. And if they did know about it, they'd be furious and they would demand that this agency be immediately
mm.
abolished. And,
You're
that's
right.
exactly what Kennedy was thinking. He confided to one of his aides that he wanted to, after the Bay of Pigs, he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the four winds.
Wow.